Today we're going to be talking about predominant function and preparing the dominant, and this mostly relates to the phrase model. So last week we expanded the phrase model. We had the tonic, the dominant, and then the tonic closure at first. We added the predominant, so you had the tonic, the predominant, the dominant, and then the tonic closure. And so we're going to be talking about how all of these features sort of work together and how to prepare the dominant when you have a predominant. Okay, so this is an example. It's sort of a cheat sheet for the phrase model. The first part of the phrase model, as we know, is the tonic area. This is usually expanded 3-4 measures or more. It's the largest part of the phrase model, and it takes us all the way up to the predominant. Sometimes there's a predominant preparation in the form of a sixth chord. You'll find that some theorists will actually classify the sixth chord as a predominant, but this is somewhat erroneous because the sixth chord never actually goes straight to the dominant. It would be very rare for that to happen. When it does happen, we have something known as a deceptive cadence. So typically, that sixth chord is used more as a predominant preparation than a predominant itself. So your typical predominant chords are going to be your 4 chord and your 2 chord. And notice I'm just using uppercase Roman numerals because it's assumed that you understand in a major key, the 4 chord is major, in a minor key it's minor. In a major key, the 2 chord is minor, and in a minor key it's diminished. So it's assumed you know the qualities based on the keys. So then the predominant moves to the dominant, and this would be a more complete expanded phrase model. And your dominant can be either a 5 chord or a 7 chord. The 7 chord is going to be much less common, and it typically will not be used at the end of a piece. Typically in the classical style, you'll have a dominant 5 chord that moves into a tonic closure. So any one of these areas can be expanded. You can have a tonic area that's expanded. You could have a predominant that's expanded, a dominant, or a tonic closure. The most common areas that are expanded, which means that it has more than one chord. So rather than just a 1 chord, you have maybe a 1 that goes to a 2, and then maybe it goes to a 6 chord, and then maybe it goes to a 4 chord. That may not be the best progression, but you could use several different chords in the tonic area to get to that predominant. So typically the predominant is just a single chord, the dominant is just a single chord, and then the tonic closure are also just a single chord. But any of these areas can be expanded, the tonic, predominant, dominant, or tonic closure. So the predominant chords are chords that lead to 5 and create a third area of the phrase model known as a predominant. Some people call it the dominant preparation, or some call it the subdominant area. Any one of these terms is correct. I typically refer to it as a predominant area. So we label the predominant as PD, so that we know very clearly that it's the predominant when we have our phrase model. So your complete phrase model now will look like T, then you'll draw a line all the way up until the predominant. If the predominant area is expanded, you draw another line to the dominant, and then you draw another line to the tonic. And you do this underneath the first layer analysis where you write in your chord progressions. You analyze all the chords in the piece. It's more common than a simple tonic, dominant, tonic phrase model. So typically with the tonic, dominant, tonic phrase model, that's going to be really common in rock music and popular music. A lot of times people say that classical music has no bearing on modern music, and that's really not true, especially if you look at the way that rock music, popular music, a lot of music is structured. There's still that basic phrase model that underlines a lot of these harmonies. You still have that tonic area, you still have that dominant area, and you still tend to come back to the home key. That's a large number of songs that we listen to today will follow this phrase model. So learning classical style music can serve as a framework because it has been so well worked out. Theorists have spent so much time analyzing classical music that we can now apply it to a wide variety of genres, and it can help us understand what more modern composers are doing. So maybe Beethoven would use a tonic, dominant, tonic phrase model, and Aerosmith would use it as well, but Aerosmith may go and use many different chords that wouldn't be used in the classical area to get to that dominant area. So it's really just a matter of whether or not you can find similarities between the classical style and modern styles of music, and often you can. And it's those differences that stand out, because it's those differences that make the styles unique. So I always have viewed the classical style and classical harmony as a way to understand and have a basic baseline of where at least Western civilization was at 200-300 years ago. And we've made some changes, but there's a lot of similarities too. So the 4 and the 2 are possible predominant chords. The 2 chord is often used in first inversion. So if you think about that, in the key of C, you have an F major chord as your 4 chord. If you play a 2 chord, it's your D minor chord. So the D minor in the F major, D minor has D, F, and A. The F major chord, the 4 chord, has F, A, and C. So they share 2 chord tones in common. So if you put the D minor chord in first inversion, you end up with an F in the bass, an A for the 5th, and then your D would be somewhere in the higher part of the register. So you'd have a chord that sounds like this. This is your D minor in first inversion. And here's your F major. But then if you double that bass note, here's your F major, your 4 chord. Here's your D minor chord, doubling the bass. They sound similar. So that 4 chord can substitute for the 2 chord, or the other way around. And that's one of the reasons why the 2 chord is so often put in first inversion, because we want to accent that bass line. We want to establish that it's just a substitution for the 4 chord. And if you listen to that one more time, let's put it a little higher. Let's just play a 4-part chord. Here's your 2 chord. Here's your 4 chord. The 4 chord is a lot stronger. It's much more stable. It's much more resonant. It's much more consonant. That 2 chord, though, it really has this strong sense that it wants to move somewhere. So maybe to that 5 chord. So by using the 2 chord in first inversion and doubling the bass, which would be the 3rd of the chord, and you should remember that we don't like to double that 3rd very often, but if we double the 3rd of the 2 chord, we create a chord that kind of sounds like a 4 chord, but has more of a forward momentum. So you'll find that if you analyze classical style music, the 4 chord's used, but more often than not, it's that 2 chord that composers like to use because it just creates that strong forward momentum. So the 4 and 2 chords share 2 of the same chord members, which makes it possible to use either one as a predominant. And if you notice, the dominant has the 5 and the 7 chord. The dominant 5 and the 7 also share 2 chord members. It's the same basic concept. So anytime you have 2 or more chord tones that are shared, these chords can typically substitute for each other, which is a concept you could use in your own compositions in a very loose manner if you wish. So let's talk about our predominant options. These are the most common ones. So in major keys, you're going to have 1 for the tonic area, and then for the predominant, I've listed those in parentheses. You've got a 4, a 2/6, or a 2. And they're probably in order from strongest to weakest. That 2 chord, even though it's in root position, it isn't a strong predominant because it's not trying to mimic the 4 chord so much. You've got that D in the bass if you're in the key of C, or the 2nd scale degree in the bass. With the 2/6, then you actually get the 4th scale degree in the bass for both the 4 and the 2/6, and that just creates a stronger predominant function. So then it can typically move to a 5 or a 5/7 chord. That would be your dominant area, and then it will come back to a tonic closure, so that's going to be your 1 chord. In the minor keys, you typically have a minor 1 to start out your phrase model, and then when you get to the predominant, typically it's only going to be a minor 4 or a 2 diminished 6. You're not going to have a minor 2 chord in a minor key. It's going to be diminished. So because it's diminished, what you're going to do is you're going to make sure you put it in first inversion. If you find a 2 diminished chord in root position in the classical style, then that's very unusual, and it's something you should probably look at a little more closely because the composer is trying to do something different. He's accenting, or she is accenting, the actual relationship between the tritone. When you put a diminished chord in root position, play it up here, you hear that tritone. If you invert it, it's still dissonant, but that tritone isn't as jarring. It softens it a little bit. So that's why that diminished triad, we always like to put it in first inversion and double the bass. So you double the third of the diminished triad as well. And that's why a 2 diminished in root position isn't an option for the minor keys, because it's going to be very rare. But it still progresses in the same way as in the major keys. It'll still go to a 5 or a 5/7 and then come back to a minor 1 chord. So when the 2 chord is in first inversion, we get the 4th scale degree in the bass. This is one reason, as I've explained, why the 2/6 is a preferred chord and can substitute for the major 4 chord. It's also why the 3rd is often doubled, since it helps to emphasize the 4th scale degree, which is the root of the 4 chord. And then additionally, in a minor key, it de-emphasizes that tritone relationship. And just remember that the diminished triad typically appears in first inversion with the 3rd doubled. Sometimes you can double the 5th, but you just don't want to double that root. The 3rd will be by far the most common way to voice the 2 diminished chord, but there may be some instances where voice leading becomes a priority and you prefer to double the 5th because that might allow you to have some stepwise motion. So predominant voice leading. Notice that the 4 chord can substitute for the 2 chord. So we have 2 examples here. We have a 1 chord going to a 1/6, so your tonic area has been expanded by the 1 and the 1/6 chord, so you draw a T under the 1, and then you would just draw that line all the way over to the 6, and then you have your predominant, the 4 chord. So notice the 6 chord, everything's moving by step, the common tone's maintained. Here we have to skip though, so we just do that to maintain smooth voice leading, and when possible we put that skip in an inner voice. And then it just goes to a 5 triad. The octave here, if you look at the G in the bass, there's also a G an octave above it. That's what this 8 stands for. The 8 just comes down to the 7th, so now we have a 5/7 chord here, but we just write it as 7, so we indicate the voice leading rather than writing 5 to 5/7. So this tells us that the octave is resolving down to the 7th, and then we just come into the 1 chord. So you'll see the 7th of the chord resolves down, leading tone resolves up. Proper resolutions, all that's great. So if we look at the second example, it's the same chord progression revoiced. So here we've done everything exactly the same. If you look at the first 2 chords, they are identical. All we've done now is we've substituted the 2/6 chord. So what this does is it allows a little more movement in the inner voices. The C comes up to the D. We end up doubling the bass note because we want to create that strong sound of a 4 chord while having that minor tonality, and then everything just resolves the same as it did here. So this is 2 different chord progressions, but only because of one single substitution of the 2/6 chord. And one thing I will point out, the reason we're writing 8 to 7 here, because we've got our 8 here coming down to a 7 here, is because that octave is listed in the notation. If we did not have this G, pretend that this G did not move by step into the 7th, then we'd probably want to write this as a 5 chord, and then we'd probably want to write it as a 5/7. We only write 8/7 if the voice leading is actually there in the notation to support it. So in this case, we do have an octave, and it does come down to the 7th. All right, so preparing the chordal 7th of the 5/7 when moving from the predominant to the 5/7. So we want to prepare the 7th of that 5/7 chord, and we want to do it typically by maintaining the common tone when we can. So between the 4 chord and the 5/7 chord, you can do that. You can maintain the common tone. I'm going to show you how in just a minute. So the 5/7, the 2 diminished, and the 4, they all have the 4th scale degree in common. So there's your big clue there. You're going to hold that common tone over. So this makes it possible to keep the common tone. So the fourth scale degree is the seventh of 5. You can think of it as the third of 2 in terms of chord members, and the root of the 4 chord. So if you think about that, you're in the key of C. If you think about the 5 chord in the key of C, it's G, B, D, and F. So that seventh of the 5 chord is your F. The third of the 2 chord, if you're in the key of C, you've got D, F, A. So the F is the third of the 2 chord. So that's the common tone with your 5 chord as well. And the root of the 4 chord, of course, in the key of C would be F. Then you have A and C. So you'd maintain that fourth there. So the 4 and the 2/6, the root and the bass of the 4, or the third, which would be the bass of the 2/6, is usually going to be doubled and held over while the bass tone resolves up by step. And for the 2 chord, the root or the bass of the 2 chord is usually doubled, and the bass leads up to the 5/7 root. So I'm going to actually show you an example of all of these. And the chordal 7th of the 5/7 chord must be held over and then resolved by step in predominant resolutions, moving from predominant to dominant to tonic. Very confusing, right? So let's go and look at an example. So one of these measures has an error in it. Can you find the error? All of these measures are doing something correct. Let's start with that. The 4 chord is moving to the 5/7 and it's maintaining the common tone. So again, the bass of the 4 chord is being held over. The third of the 2/6 chord is being held over. And then here, the third of the 2 chord is also being held over. But since the 2 chord actually has 2 common tones with the 5/7, you can hold over both the F and the D. So you always want to maintain these common tones when you can. But there's a problem with this first example. I want to see if you can find it. So pause the video. Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 seconds to pause the recording, and then I'm going to give you the answer. So where is the error in that first measure? So 3, 2, 1. All right. So the error is actually in measure 1. There's parallel fifths between the bass and the soprano. Bass and soprano. So this is why whenever we move from a 4 chord to a 5 chord, or from pretty much just the 4 to the 5 chord, we want to try and have contrary motion in the upper voices. So this first measure would be an incorrect resolution. The second one is an example of how you could do it correctly. Notice how the upper voices are moving down while the bass is moving up. If you have this similar motion between the voices, you'll probably end up with parallel octaves or parallel fifths. So you've got to avoid that. So this would be the correct resolution for this particular example. Okay, so when moving from 4 to 5/7, parallel fifths will occur when moving in similar motion. Use contrary and oblique motion to the bass instead. So measure 1 is a big example of what you should not ever do. Don't do that. The predominant should be complete, so you should have all the chord tones. You can omit the fifth of the 5/7 if needed. So when moving from 4 to 5/7 in measure 2, you'll notice that the fifth has been omitted. You've got a G, the G is doubled. Then you've got a B, and then you're missing your D, so you're missing your fifth, but you have an F. You can do that if you need to. So if you're going to omit a chord tone, pretty much standard procedure, you always omit the fifth. You don't want to omit the third, because the third gives the chord its quality. And if there's a 7th, you don't want to omit the 7th, because that's the tendency tone, and that also gives the chord its quality. For a complete chord, you should choose a 2/6 or a 2 chord as a predominant and maintain both of the common tones. Remember, only the 2/6 chord doubles the third. So in this example, you're going to double the third. So you have an F here, you have an F here that's doubled with the bass. And this is another reason why composers tend to like to use that 2 chord instead of a 4 chord, because when you're moving to the 5 chord, you can include all of the chord members. You don't have to omit any chord members. So as with the dominant, the predominant chords may also have a seventh, but it's uncommon. So 2/7, 2 half diminished 7, and 2 fully diminished 7 are going to be the most commonly used. 6/5 is a common inversion in both major and minor, again because we want that third in the bass. So here's an example of our 2 chord, just a triad here, and then notice how the other option is to write it as a 2/6/5. So here we have this F, which is the bass note, it's the third of the chord. It just moves up to a G, and then our seventh of the chord is our C, and it just comes down to a B. So that is one way to write this. And then notice here again, we've got the octave, the G, so we have an 8 here in the bass, and it just comes down to a seventh. And then we just resolve by step into our 1 chord. So that's sort of an overview of how you would use the 4 chord. It's a complex topic. One of the ways that you can really see how this is used in music is to start analyzing music, and anytime you come across a 4 or a 2 chord, see how the composer resolves it. That's really the best way to get good at this. Just lots of analysis is what you really need to do. What these sessions are doing is I'm trying to take the composers out of it. I'm trying to just concentrate on the techniques that apply to any composer who attempted to write this style of music. And it's not that this is going to be something that becomes standard in all classical composers' works. What you're seeing right here are the progressions and the tendencies and the most common sort of best practices that were used in the classical style. So if a composer decides to circumvent these styles, then that is something you should pay attention to, because that's something the composer is doing that is unique. And it's these differences among a common style that we really want to pay attention to, because that can become a characteristic feature of the composer's work, and it can just give us a better understanding of what they were actually thinking. And one of the things you should start considering is, why is it that so many composers do resolve the chordal seventh? Why is it that the leading tone does get resolved? Why is it that they double the root? Why do so many composers who write in dramatically different styles, even modern music, tend to follow these basic principles? Is it because there is something inherent about these rules that composers just tend to naturally be drawn toward? Or is it because we've been conditioned to believe that the bass should be doubled for that strong sound, the seventh needs to come down, the leading tone needs to come up? These are questions that you can start to answer for yourself as you start to learn more and more theory. And this course, of course, focuses on Western music theory. Once you're done here, there's lots of YouTube channels. Go learn about ragas. Go learn about other types of music. Go learn about jazz music. You'll find there's similarities between all this music, but there's always something that makes it different as well. And that's what is most fascinating about theory, is when you start to find these human universals, these concepts that apply no matter how dramatically different the styles are. You can't always find similarities, but when you can, and you're looking at music from the Western world and from the Eastern world, and you're finding places where we come together and both styles mesh and have similarities, that's where it gets really interesting. That's where you start to get to these more fundamental principles that seem to affect humans on a mass scale. And that's where theory becomes really fascinating. But it's going to take a little more time to get there.